the mainstream media smearing yet another outsider campaign? Well, it seems like it on the basis of a political article that was published earlier this week, which noted that two members of Marianne Williamson's campaign left. Peter Dow, who was her interim campaign manager, and Jason Call, who was the campaign's deputy manager. The article implied that somehow Marianne Williamson's campaign was too far to the left for Peter Dow, and that was the basis of him leaving. Of course, Peter Dow responded on Twitter clarifying matters, pointing out that according to the official Marianne Williamson campaign statement, he and his wife has simply been overwhelmed caring for his ailing mother, an explanation that has been echoed by the campaign. They've made many statements of mutual respect and appreciation for the substance of her campaign. Peter Dow went on to say that her campaign is the most left and focuses on issues like health care, reparations, living wage, et cetera, that continue to be priorities for him. Marianne Williamson very warmly spoke to Peter's integrity and political skill, et cetera. There seems to be a lot of affection between these two characters, but it did not keep Politico, who notably has been very critical of left candidates, certainly in my work for the Bernie campaign. They were often the tiger nipping at our heels and gave us coverage that we didn't feel was especially accurate or favorable in that context. So Peter Dow was particularly, I think, unnerved by this on Twitter, because of the insinuation that he was not left enough for the Marianne Williamson campaign, which I think is maybe an easy mistake to miss if you haven't been following Peter Dow's own political trajectory.
Right. I don't really know who this person is. The last time I heard this name, I thought that he was associated with the Hillary Clinton campaign.
He was.
So I guess I could understand why you would make that mistake. Although if you're Politico, you should probably
have looked at the internet since 2016.
Okay.
Right. So Peter Dow, I remember back when I was completely anonymous, not affiliated with politics in any way, in that race, one of the most frustrating human beings on the internet from the perspective of a leftist. He co-founded Hillary's Men, which was a group of
Men for Hillary. Men seeking Hillary.
With the commentator Tom Watson. I don't think much really came of it. Tom Watson continues to be a real cheerleader for Hillary in that wing of the establishment Democratic Party. But something happened in the course of 2020 where Peter Dow had one of the most wholesome, political turns, where he became very self-reflective and very honest about the negative role that he played in 2016 and how he was in some ways coping and overcompensating for the dissonance of his own, internal politics and what the Democrats were offering, and lashing out at leftists and lashing out at progressives in a way that was inappropriate. And he apologized, had this kind of come to Jesus moment, and was really embraced by the left community, despite many of us fighting tooth and nail with him for years leading up to that. And so it was unsurprising. I mean, it was surprising because I didn't know him in this kind of political campaign manager context, but unsurprising from a political perspective that he would be associated with Marianne Williamson's campaign.
So do you think the mainstream media is looking for any excuse to make fun of Marianne Williamson? Obviously, there's a lot of the crystal jokes and everything seems to be a staple for cable news commentators, and it's a kind of mocking treatment of her, even though she's an ardent progressive running to Biden's left. She's like an object of derision for talking heads.
Look, I do think that I can't get past the Karine Jean-Pierre press conference where she led all of the so-called journalists in a round of laughter, associating her with the crystal ball and all these sort of things that she's never made reference to.
The crystal ball, the magic implement, not crystal ball, the former host of this show.
Of course. Right. And, Marianne Williamson, she's a, best-selling New York Times author many times over. She has done these really significant programs with Feeding the Poor and all of this other kind of stuff. And it's questionable whether or not she would be characterized in the same way as she's argued, if her gender were different. Both she and RFK Jr. have had questions about the pharmaceutical industry and the overprescription of certain kinds of SSRIs, et cetera. But although he is definitely undermined by the mainstream media as an anti-vaxxer, he's not called a woo-woo crystal queen, and the emphasis seems to be a little bit different. So I do think that for both of them, the top line is they don't like the anti-establishment
both of them are being disparaged by the mainstream
100%.
media. They're not being taken seriously at all, even though RFK Jr. especially, but Marianne as well. And together, they are right now, according to polls, I mean, they're in there, and they're not being treated like an afterthought, like they have 0.1% or something. There's no indication the DNC has given that there'll be any debate featuring them. Again, it's just vicious mockery on the Williamson case, and and immediately pivoting to and pointing to RFK Jr.'s past alleged anti-vax kind of agenda as something that should turn and deter any right-thinking Democrat from consorting with him or being interested in him at all. That's what you hear from all corners of the mainstream media.
Right. So Elon Musk, of course, last night opened up the Twitter Spaces as a forum more broadly than just to Ron DeSantis, saying that if another candidate were interested in using that platform, he would be happy to make it available to them. I think it would be really interesting if one of these outsider Democratic candidates
Marianne should do it. I would expect that RFK Jr. would do it. I saw, and we're working on getting him on this show. I'm sure we will have him on the show very soon. He's made himself very available, and we have Marianne on frequently. RFK Jr. is clearly making himself very available to media. I saw an article about he's doing literally everyone's show and podcast, which is what you should be doing, which is what you have to do to get yourself out there to make people interested in what you're saying and aware of who the real person is and what your views really are, because you get such a just biased, Biden worshiping perspective from the mainstream media that wants to portray, those two individuals, especially as real kooky and real outside on everything. Even though you may say you may not like one of their views on something, but you're not getting the full picture at all.
Of course. Case Study QB, who is an internet account that posts a lot of clips from the mainstream news for people who live online and aren't necessarily tuning into cable all day, he pointed out that there is going to be a one-on-one with Asa Hutchinson, who you may or may not know is a GOP candidate, and that a liberal outlet like CNN is more willing, it seems to be very open to devoting that kind of time and energy to a candidate polling at 1%, but seems to be really doing a blackout for RFK Jr. and Marianne, who in the most recent poll are both polling at 11%. In an earlier poll, were polling at, I think, 20% and 9%, RFK Jr. at 20% and Marianne Williamson at 9%. Biden also, with the terrible poll numbers where a majority of Democratic voters don't actually want him to run. The same is true, obviously, of Donald Trump. But we're living in a media space where Fox News is much more receptive to having outsider insurgent candidates on, including Marianne Williamson and RFK Jr., who have both frequented those shows.
And Nikki Haley and Tim Scott and Vivek Ramaswamy, people who are not polling particularly highly, but they're taking the Republican world, the conservative world, there are some deep divides, and a lot of these media organizations on the right side take their obligation very seriously to, or maybe you can look at it cynically. It's good for content. It's good for their organizations.
Well,
whatever
CNN
it is,
needs the
they're
content.
letting you hear about it. Yeah,
CNN needs the ratings. That's what's so confusing about it.
CNN cynically won't let you watch anything, or naively, not cynically, naively, even though it might make their programming more interesting, and it might have people outside their shrinking, resistance-loving libs become interested in the company.
Well, that's what's so confusing. They will have a CNN town hall with Donald Trump, but they won't sit down with Democratic candidates. I was recently listening to an interview on Katie Halper's podcast where she was talking to Ben Smith, founder, former head of BuzzFeed News, founder of Semaphore, all of these things. And he was talking about, in the early days of the internet, places like Huffington Post, they often were founded by right and left figures alike. Vice was like this with the former Proud Boys,
Gavin subsequent
Proud Boy founder, Gavin McInnes.
Yeah, although I don't know that he considered himself right at the time. But
the point I'm just trying to make.
But yeah, Huffington Post had Breitbart.
The Breitbart founder, right. So Steve Bannon, apparently at the time, there was this conversation about, what the future of the media was going to be. And Ben Smith, because he wrote this book about the history of the media that he's been
I'm 2/3 of the way through it right now. It's really good.
One of the cases that he made, that Steve Bannon made, was to go to Huffington Post and say, look, all of the energy on the right is obviously with Donald Trump in 2016. We're chasing that down. We're using that to inform our coverage, and it's paying big dividends. The energy on the left is clearly with Bernie Sanders. Why aren't you going all in on Bernie Sanders? Why isn't Huffington Post going all in on Bernie Sanders? And Katie asked him, well, why didn't you? And Ben Smith says, well, from an integrity perspective, a journalistic perspective, we felt like we needed to do balls and strikes. Now, from a leftist perspective, they weren't doing that either. They were, in fact, actively.
And that's at odds with what they did. Maybe I haven't gotten to that part of the book yet. I'm like 2/3 of the way through it. But the Huffington Post is all in for Barack Obama, and BuzzFeed, those institutions totally go all in, whole hog for Obama. In fact, Ben Smith writes very honestly about how this is at the time analytics are taking shape, and they're realizing that, okay, a post that says something positive, it was very positive. It was not so much at the time that they were being rewarded, I think, in those media organizations for being like stridently anti-Hillary, but they were being extremely rewarded for being earnestly, sincerely, heart eyes emoji for Obama. You can't tell me that was like journalistic integrity.
Right. I thought it was a weak. I mean, I'd love to talk to him about it and do some follow-up questions. But this is the question: why isn't CNN interested? Why does it seem like Steve Bannon, politically not a fan, but in terms of his media insights, he does
stylistically,
he does seem to know what he's talking about. And people have been complaining that apparently he's been rooting for RFK Jr. to run and was pushing him to run, and some on the left are uncomfortable with that political association. But just in terms of a raw political skill point, I do think it's really curious that CNN is obviously trying to shake things up and do things differently, but it's never, ever do things differently in the direction of the left.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. How about that? All right, we'll have more Rising right after this.